write the Discord announcement real quick.
Games. I'm your co-host, Mango. Oh yeah, that's right. And I'm gonna tweet about it maybe. You yeah, let's tweet about this. If anybody's watching right now, which I don't think they are, besides happening. Tell me when we're live whenever you want to write the announcement.
Okay. So the announcement, I just wrote it, I published it, and I'll also write a tweet. All right.
Apparently my Twitter doesn't want it. Anyway, we're going live. Fuck this. I will retweet you. That's the smartest solution. Rather than trying to fix it myself. Anyway, transition to live. Hello, welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about exploration in D20 systems, roughly, TTRPGs, maybe a little bit more generally, but whatever. Before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
Well, on this podcast, we like to talk about games, and it has also been a while since we've done like a true tabletop episode, it feels like. So we're returning a little bit. I guess it hasn't been a while. We did one just the other week. Yeah, I was thinking like from before the Marvel movies.
yeah. I mean, so funnily enough, that was our last episode since we skipped last week on my account. Because 2 weeks ago was the Pathfinder 2 episode.
That's true. Yeah, so we literally just did one. Well, I don't feel bad about doing 2 in a row. So basically,
it's been a while since we've done like a big theoretical one, but
yeah. So this is a big theory episode, a game design theory episode that I'm interested in.
Just to set the stage a little bit, kind of what this came out of was with the kind of like sea shanties taking over the Blagosphere, as it were. It put an idea in my head for basically a campaign pitch me based on kind of like inspired by the Northwest Passage, which is fascinating history. If any of you want to go out there and find out about the Northwest Passage, this is Titus Sea Shanties.
Go out to the Northwest Passage. Do you want to go into?
So if you listen to the song,
Frozen Arctic.
If you listen to the song that inspired this in my mind, it's called "The Northwest Passage" by Stan Rogers. Go look up him. Go look up the actual Northwest Passage. Go look at the song. It's a fantastic song. But it's about a guy following in the footsteps of the Canadian explorers. Well, I guess they're British at that point. Following footsteps of the explorers to the Northwest Passage by basically driving that route over the northern Canada. It's a very good song. He also wrote a sea shanty called Bear's Privateers. Very interesting, dude. Northwest Passage is separately also very interesting. Anyway, that campaign might be interesting, but it's basically only interesting because it's an exploration campaign, right? Otherwise, it's a standard exploration campaign. And this is a thing that I think hasn't been handled well by the rules. I think the Paizo 2E, or the Pathfinder 2E rather, exploration rules are an interesting or are a good start, but I don't think they're a full thing. And then when I was talking to Buddy about this, he mentioned that a while ago he was doing his own campaign. He had thought also about exploration. So we figured it would be a good episode to talk about. Anyway, Buddy, do you have any opening thoughts on this?
Okay, so here's my core thing, my core question. I don't quite have a hypothesis in the way that I do with some of these other theory videos. My core question is why, right? Because this is something that translates so well into games that we all like love, right? It translates so well into, right, to be topical, like Valheim, but even just like Minecraft, right, or Ark, or any of these sorts of
Or I mean,
Factorio, right? We're
Skyrim even, right?
constantly Skyrim, yeah, we're constantly in these games that are about, like exploring the wilderness, this like vast kind of unknown space, and you're going through and you're sort of charting it down. I think that there is something really like fundamentally fun about that, and video games have captured that fun incredibly well, as far as I'm concerned, right? But I haven't seen it in D&D, which is part of why I wanted to run a campaign along these lines, right? Um and I put a bunch of work into one for After Hell's Rebels. There was a while where I was like working really hard on like prepping this like exploration campaign, like the idea of which was that it's sort of like a new world. The idea was it's called Seventh Expedition. So the idea is that there were like seven like different attempts at exploring the new world, and they all sort of ended in disastrous failure, and the players are the seventh of those,
Which
right?
is
And
also
so,
like the Northwest Passage.
which is also like the Northwest Passage, right? It's also like Lewis and Clark. I was
Yeah.
thinking in Lewis and Clark terms. I was like, what happens if like Lewis and Clark got sent out by Thomas Jefferson and just never came back, right? And that happened a bunch of times, right? Because these, the wilderness or whatever, this new place is so dark and foreboding, which I really like as a campaign idea, because it kind of both has the setup for like the new stuff in the world, right? Like you come across a new patch of land, and there are, whatever, there's some ancient secret that no human eyes have ever seen. You're completely in the dark. But there's also that ability to like there's the mystery, right? Oh, this is a journal from the fourth expedition, and we now have information about what happened to them, right? Kind of solving those mysteries. I think those two things together are like fun, and interesting. But the whole idea of it was it's an exploration campaign where you're trying to fill in a map, basically, right? You're trying to go sort of from location to location and chart a course, go deeper every time, right? This is a core thing that I capture very easily in video games, but I've never successfully found in a tabletop RPG. The idea of like I venture out for a couple of days. I prepare myself for that venture, right? Like I pack enough food and I repair all my stuff or whatever. And I might like make camp along the way or whatever. And then I'll go reach my goal, and then I will go back to base. And there's a multi-day sort of excursion, right? So over the course of, let's say, 5 days, two of which are sort of like traveling with camping involved. And this is a very core D&D idea, but it isn't something that has ever really been systemized well. Like this is the thing that's built for like random encounters, which are terrible. Everybody
Yeah.
hates random encounters, right? And so I don't have a good answer for that question. I don't have a good answer for that why question. Um, maybe it's just like an exploring a 3D space is better than theater of the mind. I don't know. This may be the first clue.
Yeah.
Uh,
So part of this, like, there's this joy of discovery, which I agree with you on. I think part of the reason why it doesn't work well in existing systems is a lot of them are kind of pass fail rolls with no degree of success, and like that's kind of it, right? Like like you spend the hour exploring the hex, and then like you roll a perception check, and that's basically it, right? And like part of what like what makes combat compelling, because I think combat, the thing with the D20 system best is like you get a lot of attempts, a lot of bites at the apple, um, and you can have like basically degrees of success, right? Like on top of like hitting and maybe critical hitting, you also roll damage, and that damage might be good or it might be bad, right? Like various abilities have saves or whatnot, so that all gives you kind of like a texture, I guess, of outcomes, and like they're also varied enough that like this kind of almost relates to what we were talking about, right? Like um, uh, you have varied combat encounters. I think the problem is with a lot of exploration stuff is a lot of it is kind of the spiritual equivalent of parsing on patchwork, right? Like you're just rolling against kind of like an arbitrary number, a number that's usually kind of hard to define, right? Like when you're fighting, like say like the big dumb brute that's backed up by like kind of like the smart wizard, right? Like you can make some smart decisions and be like, okay, I'm going to use the thing that forces a fort save against a wizard and the thing that forces a will save against a dumb brute, and be like, aha, I have made the smart decision. I have targeted my spells correctly, and that feels rewarding in some ways. Right, and that's a little bit more direct mechanical complexity. Um, I think part of it too might be kind of like, and maybe you can get away with this more with new players, but like the kind of behind the veil, right? Like what's it like? Um, things have like the game has to keep running at some point, right?
Yeah.
Like which is this kind of like, if I'm pulling back if I'm if I'm looking in this exploration, like how does it actually feel like I'm discovering something, which I think is a little bit harder to sell just kind of off the top. Which I think goes back to your point, like maybe 3D space is just a better sell than theater of the mind, but
Yeah,
uh,
especially because like something that I feel like happens kind of commonly is you walk into an encounter and it feels like the GM had something kind of scripted there. And there's that impulse in a way to sort of follow the railroad,
right,
right? Where it's just like, if I'm running through Minecraft and I, encounter whatever, because I know it's all procedurally generated, right? Like I'm kind of reacting much more on the fly, whereas something that is more like handcrafted doesn't feel that same doesn't feel that same way, I guess.
yeah,
I don't know how I feel about that. Right? Like part of me thinks that this is something that is GMs don't do enough of, right? Where maybe the true version of this is you have a map and it has 100 hexes and the GM spends however 100 hours planning out what's in each and every one of those hexes, and every single one is a kind of like a real solid encounter, or more maybe, right? That isn't something that you're just like rolling random on a table. But I wonder if that is too, does that feel too scripted? Does that sort of like remove in a way like the agency uh of the players? And this is something that I do think is possible, right? Like I guess I'm operating under that philosophy when I talk about Seventh Expedition. That was how I was approaching Seventh Expedition, right? But I do think that there is just something to it compared to the world of like I'm walking and I just happen to find this monster, right? And I have to kind of like deal with that sort of thing on the fly. You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah. I I, I agree. I think another part of this is in I think it relates to what you were saying. Um, is that there's not a lot of like in terms of like those scripted things. It's like not a lot of cleverness together, like because that's I think part of the excitement of discovery, right? Like in Minecraft it's a little bit less because like but like you can cut through things, right? Like you can warp the terrain. In something like Skyrim, sometimes it's a matter of like finding the right entrance or like figuring out how to get around it. And there's I think a level of glee there when when you manage to sequence break something, get you know, horse mountain climb your way over into a place that you're not supposed to be early, or something like that, which I think is part of this. Um, with a lot of these encounters in tabletops, it's less kind of like, can I figure out how to cleverly do this, and can I roll the like a high enough climb check or something, which
Yeah.
like I think like in theory should be kind of in this on the same way, where like I prepared my character to climb, therefore I can outsmart this, but like it doesn't feel the same because it's just kind of a raw roll. So maybe like maybe there's a way to do that. I was something that popped into my head is maybe like setting up kind of like barriers you can't barriers that the players can't overcome, that you run into relatively quickly, right? Like so, like at the beginning of your like this is harder to do for an exploration campaign because it implies a lot of backtracking. But like you run into a wall that you can't scale, or the kind of classic version of this is like an enemy you can't defeat, and that's very visible, and so you
Yeah,
have to
this
run
is
away.
like death, what are they called? Death claws,
Yeah,
just
yeah,
north of the starting town in Fallout New Vegas, right? Most players run north towards Vegas, encounter death claws, get shit stomped, and then do go south, right? Kind of along the loop, which I actually like, to be honest. I think that was good game design. Because like if you are clever, if you are smart, if you use the sneak skill at night and can slip by, maybe you can, right? Like maybe you can kind of get past, the train yard of death claws. Um, but most players will sort of like react to the environmental stimulus and go, you know, and go south. But I think part of that is that games have a better, like video games have a better way of showing players that they are not prepared for
Right.
encounters because they can kill them, right?
Right.
In a Pathfinder game, if you go north when the north hex is built for a level 8 party and you're a level 1 party and you TPK, that feels awful. That's terrible, right?
Yeah.
But in Fallout, it's just a reloaded save. That's not a big deal at all. Which almost makes me wonder, like, maybe you could set up some kind of crazy, just like, I don't know, you respawn.
Yeah. So
You could
this is
say that like the by magic the characters are respawning, right? Or something like that.
this is actually a thing that I was thinking of. Basically roguelite popped into my head, and like there's an Angry GM article from some time ago that where he's like, somebody challenged me to like run a campaign where death wasn't a real obstacle, right? It's like, well, and so basically he was like, well, when the characters die, they all spawn in like this, graveyard. They're like cursed or something, right? And like, you can futz with that a little bit, right? If you die too many times, yet, but like essentially, the game becomes almost a roguelite. That would work, but that's also like a weird way to treat an exploration campaign, right? Like I think that's an interesting thing to do, but I don't know if that like really hits the same kind of things as like a true exploration. Like that's, I think, a good dungeon delving campaign, right? Where you die, you pop up back to the surface, but you keep your experience, right? Um,
I do think that could make for a good exploration campaign, specifically with the right. So you need a couple things. One, corpse runs, which would be a thing, right? Like you die, your weapons and armor are left out there, right? And you might have to get them back. And I think that that's a kind of neat, like that's like a neat mechanical hurdle for people to get across. And two, encumbrance has to be a thing. Maybe this is a key because like part of what I'm thinking about is like something that I do. Valheim has the option. It's an exploration game. It has the option for you to mark a map, right, and label the mark. So it's pretty common for me to go out into the forest, into wherever, right, come across something like, oh, here's a dungeon, but I don't have the inventory space to do it, or I'm too low, or my equipment is broken, or something like that, or I know I'm looking for pine wood. I'm not here for a dungeon. So I just mark it on the map and I come back to it sort of later or whatever. Part of that decision is an encumbrance decision, right? If I'm looking for pine wood, I'm going to fill up my encumbrance with pine wood, and I don't want to spend essentially encumbrance on this trip on whatever is down in the dungeon, right? Also, if I find a copper deposit, right, I don't want to waste my encumbrance on copper. I'm going to mark the copper on the map, and the next time I need copper, I'm going to come back for it, kind of that thing. I feel like the encumbrance rules are necessary for creating that, because that is specifically not a thing that happens for me in Minecraft, where I eventually, you don't quite have a limitless inventory, but you have effectively,
Effectively,
compared to
yeah.
Valheim, yeah, a much, much, much more expanded inventory, right? And I'm making decisions constantly about Valheim based on my encumbrance, whereas in something like Minecraft, I'm not. And so I think if I were to be pitching this sort of roguelite experience where, like, let's say the characters respawn in Seventh Expedition, I said that there's an island off coast that is properly settled, right, but that the continent itself is not, right? So sort of that serves as home base. That's how people have access to shops and stuff. And if you need to do whatever, like whatever that kind of stuff happens, right, it can happen on essentially the island. um Maybe there's a thing where it's just like, okay, you respawn on the island, but you're naked, right? So banking and inventory management becomes a big deal, because dying, I feel much less, I feel much better about killing people, right? Dying is not something that I'm going to shy away from, or I'm going to protect my players from, right? TPKs is not something I'm going to protect the party from, right? I'm going to allow a party to TPK because I know they're just going to pop up on the back end. And it is up to the party to properly manage themselves, right? They have a chest at their home base where they can go, okay, you know what? We all died. We need to go back and get our stuff, which means we're going to have to go to the local whatever and buy a bunch of kind of, you know, smoothed over gear that allow me to like make the corpse run and get back to my corpse. Or conversely, one of my players dies in the middle. Well, now the other players have to then loot his corpse and dedicate their encumbrance to carrying the weight, and that's sort of like a death penalty that's not a TPK kind of penalty. I think those systems in general maybe work together in such a way that you could get them to work in a tabletop situation. So that's maybe my first hypothesis of this of this podcast
Yeah,
is that if you have that kind of encumbrance and death system, maybe you can make it work a little bit better.
so I think that's actually a really cool idea. I think that because so I think the difference between Seventh Continent or Seventh Expedition and Northwest Passage is that that works if you're doing kind of like a generalized explore, which is kind of like what Kingmaker is. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
um, whereas like the Northwest Passage is kind of like a one-way trip, right? So like
Oh
making it
yeah, interesting.
like, and also I kind of refuse to accept that the way to do this is to kind of like fundamentally break the death mechanic, right? Like there's got to be a better way to like make this work with kind of like the existing mechanics, right? Like, and like I think that's a very cool idea for a very cool campaign, but I think there's got to be a way to make the exploration work without kind of leaning on those things. I think the thing that you're kind of touching on that I think makes a lot of sense is one, I think encumbrance needs to be part of it,
Mhm.
and like you have to do a lot of like planning. I think part of this too is that what the death rule lets you do, and you identify this, is it lets you kind of shortcut the fact that there's not a great way to telegraph that you're gonna die, right? Like, I mean, maybe the answer there is like in making that telegraph better, right? Like
Oh,
figuring
I
it.
see what you're saying. Yeah, I get that. Maybe in Seventh Expedition you have the no, this is dumb. Well, okay, I'm gonna complete this thought just for the sake of it. I was thinking in Seventh Expedition maybe you have a certain amount of like scouts, right? So you can have sort of people who are not the party test for you certain kinds of encounters. So, like, hypothetically speaking, if you discover a troll in a hex, right, you could have a scout party deal with it as a way to. But I think, first of all, one, that's too unwieldy. Second of all, that kind of removes the fun of exploration in a
Yeah,
way. Because part of the fun of exploration is like you figuring this shit out on your own, sort of thing. So yeah, I do think that it is about telegraphing. And maybe part of this is a better way to inflict massive damage or prevent massive damage, I guess, in ways that players kind of like understand. I guess players understand when they take a big hit, right? But like because we tend to kind of hold off on describing hit point values, we don't have the same way that if I go to a Skyrim dungeon and I am grossly underleveled for that dungeon, and I hit an enemy with my sword attack, and I know how much, because I see the health bar, how much my sword attack is supposed to chunk their health bar. If it only goes down, boop, little sliver, I'm like, oh, no, 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 this is too bad, and then I want to leave, right? But like D&D doesn't have a great way to telegraph that for
yeah. I mean,
players.
so some of the online systems do, right? Like I think Roll20 and at least Fantasy Grounds have options where you can like show the health bar without actually showing the number, and I think like that
That's
actually
true. Yeah.
accomplishes that. But like that you on a pure tabletop, right? Like you need like you need a better system for that, right? Like
Yeah, I
red
think
health
I think
bars that
that's
you like erase smidgens on or whatever. But that I don't think that quite works, right? Like
because even communicating that like it doesn't look like the creature is affected by this at all, like that, it doesn't have the same sort of I feel like I hear that all the time, you know and
right,
and there is an implicit assumption when I walk into a D&D game that any encounter the DM is going to show me is one that I am going to be able to complete.
right,
um and that's sort of the problem that like telegraphing needs to help.
yeah, yeah. Uh,
Maybe there's an environmental way to do this. This is another Valheim thing, where certain areas of the map will have a kind of like so for instance, if I go to a mountain, but I don't have like fur clothes, I'm gonna get the freezing like condition, and the freezing condition is going to slowly tick away my health. So I know, okay, I can't go to the mountains yet. That I'm gonna have to figure out some way to get there, which is sort of like a soft lock on it, right? um Maybe something sort of along those lines might
so
work.
that's an interesting thing. There are environmental rules in Pathfinder that I don't think I've ever seen used in either edition, right? Like like
Yeah, but I think the environmental rules are, yeah, this podcast is brought to you by Valheim, by the way. The environmental rules are built to be overcome in a way. Like they are a sort of a like a status effect that runs under the course of the encounter, right? Um, what I'm describing is something that is more prohibitive than that, right?
Okay.
Where if I walk into a desert and I'm taking ticking every minute, I take 5 HP damage. That's a lot different than me being like rolling fort saves to stop from being exhausted or whatever. Like the rules are always very tame with this kind of
Right.
thing,
Okay.
such that it's like, oh, you go into the desert and your burly fighter, he can withstand it, but your wizard now has a debuff for the duration of the stay. I do think that those mechanics are good, by the way, and I would want to use them in an exploration game quite heavily. But I don't think that they are fulfilling the game design purpose that I'm outlining.
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying. Um, you also zoomed in real far just now. Uh,
Oh my god. Oh, it did it again. Man, I do not understand. Hold on. I know how to fix this.
oh, you zoomed out again.
Yeah. It's because of this like Logitech capture um thing that we
Yeah, you can tell both of us are using it because you have a Logi in your lower right hand corner and I have an Eigel in my lower left since I'm mirrored. But uh, anyway, so I think I agree with you. I think environment a tool in that toolbox. I do think I feel I feel like what I really want is a good way to do this with creatures because I think like you need to like maybe set up the battlefield so that like it's like a giant troll and he doesn't fit into the cave that you just came out of, but he smashed your party member and you can drag him back in and you're safe in there. And it's like you can't.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I think that's actually huge. One of the things that I think is a big deal about games like Minecraft or like WoW or something, for instance, is the ability to drop combat. It's not something that D&D supports very well. So I think that that's a necessary piece of the puzzle. Is you have to be able to drop combat. If you are in a losing combat, you need to be able to retreat pretty safely. Um, and or like if you kind of come upon an encounter, you need to kind of be able to mitigate that encounter pretty safely.
yeah, no, I think that's actually a good point. I think you need to set like I think this is like a lot of encounter design things that like
Yeah.
you know, set up, that like there's a bird that's kind of sitting there, he's not particularly observant, so you can like kind of get close enough, but like not, with, or like, figure out ways to like, maybe there's like a thing that like, you hint it right, like you like when you're launching off of on this expedition, one of the things that they give you is some way to like retrieve a fallen ally or something, right? Like, that's like a limited use, right? Like
Oh, like a scroll of town portal or something, right? If
yeah,
somebody gets really fucked up, they could just zop out.
right. And hey, that's actually kind of like what's it called? Like you could build that into like a talisman, right? Like this was another thing I was thinking about with your roguelite thing is like this will
Mhm.
like let people use like talismans or kind of like scrolls more, right? Like temporarily consumable things. Um, it's like, oh, like if you get hit, um that you would go down like it's essentially like orc ferocity and a talisman or something that like will give you the opportunity uh to get out.
Yeah.
um
Yeah, I mean, I do think that those sorts of effects would be really useful. Obviously, I wouldn't want something like a Hearthstone, like a World of Warcraft Hearthstone, I mean. But I think that that effect as a high price consumable, like as a kind of break in case of emergency sort of thing, would actually be really nice, right? If I was in a party, or if I was running this game, I would probably want to start the party. Everybody has one, and like if you guys get in over your heads, you can just you can get out of there with a certain amount of right. You wouldn't want people casting it in combat, obviously, but you would want to be able to preserve their ability to sort of like really retreat and pay a cost, right? But like really retreat from tough negative situations like that.
okay, how about this, right? Like it's expensive, um uh and it's like something that like you like one person can use it and they'll pull the whole party out, right? um and then like maybe some like lesser things, like things that like let you retreat from the combat without like like if you're really screwed, right? Like the thief or the mage can like pull out a scroll of like get the fuck out of here, and like
Oh, I see. Yeah.
the 3 rounds the whole team gets pulled back out and it's like, well, that was our one, right? But like if you're in the more intermediate case, you can like have like like the fighter steps out first. He gets smashed by the ogre. He goes down, but he's got like the trinket of invisible retreat, which like one round later he gets up with a nice stealth bonus, and he can like get back to the cave, so you guys can get back. But like it's not it's not a as it's like a get away from here free, but it's not like a win free type thing.
Yeah, like something if it casts a very temporary invisibility and expeditious retreat,
Yeah,
and everybody could just hightail it out of there, sort of thing. I
yeah,
actually do think that you could probably make it work just on the monsters, right? Like as a GM, if I just communicate to the players like, listen, monsters are typically doing their own thing, and they're not really interested in like chasing you down naturally.
yeah,
So if an encounter goes bad and you want to book it, just run to the edge of the battle map and book it, kind of thing, right? I actually think that begs like a follow up question about battle maps. See, this is another piece of the puzzle. I think the because of the way that battle maps work, you have a break between exploration and combat that doesn't exist in some of these other games, right? Like
yeah,
my exploration in Minecraft is the exact same as my combat in Minecraft. I'm traversing through the exact same space, right? So it is so seamless to go from one to the other and to create, combats that are huge and move long distances, right? Or also are like contained and you're kind of like snaking through. And part of like that is fun, I think, but is not well supported in the rules because you need to design ludicrously huge maps, right?
yeah,
Like, I mean, I used a lot of pre-rendered maps and I made a lot of maps, and the maps I were making were like honestly fucking gigantic, right? Much bigger than lots of other people's maps. But I just think that like that that's a core piece of the puzzle where maybe you would have to I don't know, almost like kind of like instance the maps like I was talking about. Like you would have it be it's a square, it you know, if you run to the edge of the square and you leave the map, the thing isn't expected to chase you, right? You can kind of leave the combat that way. Maybe that kind of thing is how it works. I also don't know that I love like the transition of okay, we are now transitioning from an exploration down into the battle map, right?
yeah.
Um
I think so. I think some of this I think kind of works naturally, right? Like dungeons, I think you can naturally map out the entire thing. On the other hand,
mhm,
I think part of what you're talking about with these kind of like condensed versus expanded distances, um, like I think actually one of the advantages of something like a TTRPG is you could like you can do really long distances that you can't practically do in video games, right? Like like famously like Daggerfall is like the biggest game map ever, I think, which is like and it's all procedurally generated. It's not thought to be very good, but like Azeroth, like you can run all the way across Kalimdor in like probably like half an hour, right? Like on
yeah.
foot, which is not very far if you think about it, right? Um, uh, so like and I think like that's supposed to be again, like I said, a strength, right? Like that you can do like these long distances. I think maybe the the kind of key here is to like not drop into battle map until like until initiative is rolled, right? Like keep it all
Mhm.
in theater of the mind until like a fight happens, and at that point, like it's not like a hard edge of the battle map type thing, right? Like this is a kind of like you um this is a kind of like you attempt to retreat and like they'll chase you for a while, but like uh you figure out a way to like make disengaging like a real thing, right? Like in a like like survival or stealth out into the woods. But part of this too is just kind of like how do you make that feel like realistic, right? Like there's like a situation where like you would expect somebody like to chase you down, like if it's like something that's hunting you for food, you'd expect it to hunt you down. And so maybe part of this is like that border is a thing where like things you're dealing with like yeah, again encounter design, right? Like a fort where like somebody shoots you from the wall and nobody comes out of the fort, but like that fucking shot hurts. Like maybe we're not prepared to deal with this. Maybe this is like or like it's like I said like uh when you come upon like the big beast, it's the thing that can't fit into the hole that you came out of, so that you gotta like an obvious retreat
Yeah, I
point.
also think part of this is just in general monster design stuff that I don't see
Yeah.
a lot of people using in D&D, but would be like important. One of the things that I did in House of Rebels that I thought was very important was you guys fought multiple sort of stages of monsters, right? Like, so like the beastmen were kind of like a recurring threat. The first time you were engaging with them, it was, like it was the first time that you had seen them, but over time you got better and better at fighting them, and you understood they had persistent mechanics, right? Because they had that blood, they had that whatever it was called, burning blood, right? They had that burning blood thing, and eventually you just didn't even have to deal with it anymore, right? Because I think Jimmy took like the cleanse, the detox spell, so you could just like cleanse the poison, or whatever else. But I think that sort of fundamental design is something that is lacking a lot of the time from tabletop games, where people are just sort of pulling things out of the book, and it's not like I have an ability to kind of understand and scale up the monster experiences, or I know what to look for because I have fought this before and I have seen. It's like, okay, well, I've seen ungors, right, the very low level beastmen. Now we're fighting gores or bestigores, and these guys are harder and they're faster and they're hitting more, but like they're still kind of on the same play pattern, almost sort of like a boss, actually, now that I think about it. In like a WoW dungeon, there's the normal version, there's the heroic version, there's the mythic version, right? And they all kind of pile mechanics on top of one another, so that like somebody can walk in with very basic competency, never having seen the boss before, and probably like get it. Um, and then when they see the heroic version, they're like, oh, it's this but more. And then the mystic version is, oh, it's this but more, right? I think that's very important to an exploration game, because it would make, first of all, it would kind of like establish like ecosystems and biomes and stuff like that, which I think would be useful, right? But secondly, it would make characters like knowledgeable and sort of informed about the threats before they enter combat and roll initiative, right? If you have fought 6 trolls by now of varying types and varieties, seeing your seventh, you have a pretty good understanding of if this thing is going to fuck you up or if this is like a challenge. And I think now that I have said that out, that might be the core. I want to I think the core of an exploration game is making players choose the encounters, whereas the core of sort of like a more narrative focused game is like they are kind of like progressing through
Mm.
preset encounters, right? I want an experience where the players uncover the mouth of a dungeon, but they're already 3 days into their trip. They've burned a lot of pots, they burned all their healing whatevers, you know they're almost full on encumbrance, right? They have a lot of stuff in their bags. They go, you know what, let's mark this dungeon down, we'll come back to it later, right? Or they come up to a troll and they say, boy, this troll, we're probably pretty deep into this troll's territory, into this troll's hunting grounds, but we're pretty fresh. We have done, we haven't done too much taxing stuff. I think we should take the troll on, right? Like I think we should fight the troll, and then it becomes about like them choosing to opt into the troll fight, which that's what it is. I think when I think about what is the fundamental piece that makes an exploration game tick, it's like that piece of like making the choices about how they want to sort of progress and go back to base.
Yeah, no, I think that absolutely makes sense. I like that a lot. I like that a lot. Um, I think that what part of this too. I think part of it too is like so rather the thing I want to specifically bring up is Pathfinder 2 actually it has roles, right? Like your arcana, your a religion, occult, and nature are supposed to be like kind of your 4 fundamental knowledge roles.
Okay.
Um, and the guidance on the skills isn't particularly great. It's like if you beat the DC that you've decided, they learn some information. If they beat it by more, they learn some more. And like that's like it's like basically that level of kind of like tell them more, tell them less, and like kind of like sends you to the wind about like how much that should be, right? Like because I mean the flip side of this is like you get things like I think it was like 40 where you get like bear lore, um, where like you need to roll high levels to like learn things that would be considered basic. Um,
Hmm.
so I think it's a problem of kind of like necessity, but like I've seen like my GMs for the PF2E games I've played have tried to systemize a little bit more. It's like, oh, you get like one fact, and then like if you get a crit, you get like a second one, or something. Which is, and they've got like a list of things that you could learn about the creature. And I'm not a huge fan of that, but I think that that's kind of like the right kind of like uh kind of like baseline, right? Like, you know, you roll, and if you beat it, you get some like very basic information, and like maybe you can target something if you like want to know, you know, like, oh, I want to know, I want to try and recall like what this thing's weaknesses are. But I think part of that should be also kind of like comparative CR, right? Like, you know, like,
Yeah.
and that's how you can kind of get that kind of like, you know, health bar not going down type of thing. It's like, this thing looks like it's gonna kick your ass, right? Like, um, and basically the thing there is to give players the opportunity to do that before they actually get into a fight. It costs an action, which, um, you know, usually, so at least in my experience, somebody will go for the roll and figure it out. But like, and like I think like rangers can do it for free, or like one particular type of ranger, like one of like the paths is, um, and that will like, I think, like kind of like emphasizing those mechanics. I think it's maybe the right way to do it, because it
Yeah.
enables players to make those choices.
I'm actually pretty down for this, and I think you are correct. Specifically because I like the puzzle atmosphere of it in the sense of okay, so here's sort of like a skeleton of systems that I feel like kind of scratches this niche. Let's say I'm the GM, right? The players are a party, a pretty standard whatever like party. They enter a hex for the first time, right? So they enter a new area. They get basic information about that area. What biome, right? Maybe they get like time of day or whatever. All of that kind of stuff. And then they have an opportunity to sort of make like make the check, right? But the check itself takes a prohibitive amount of time. Not like super prohibitive, but like you can't spam it, right? So less than an action. Let's say it takes like an hour, right? It takes an hour for your wizard to do Arcana, right? And that's the only thing your party could do at the time. Okay, this is falling apart a little in my head. So it's like the only thing your party could do. So like as you enter the place, right? And you get a basic blurb of information. Oh, this, you came from the hills. The hills have now sort of flattened a little bit, but a bunch of pine trees have sprouted up, and there are indications of like bark stripped from random trees as you start to look around, right? And the group might go, okay, that's interesting. We have a couple of different skills here, and if we apply them individually, we're going to get different kinds of information. So maybe the druid uses nature. Oh, well, the bark ripping is actually a thing that bears do. This is probably bear territory, right? Like this is the good information. But let's say the party chooses poorly. And it's like, oh, maybe this is a religious thing, and we're going to use religion and see if that, I don't know, this is whatever. And the GM might go, you get nothing, right? And now the hour has progressed, so like the players have lost like a real sense of time. And if they want, they can do it again, right? They can just sort of spam through all of the skills. But as that time mounts, so does sort of like their danger, their exposure, whatever else, right? So let's say maybe the first one is free, the first two are free even. But by the third one, now you're rolling to see if the bears notice you, right? By the sixth one, the bears absolutely notice you, kind of thing. What would you say about a sort of system along those sorts of lines?
Okay,
For does that sort of like fill your
so
requirement?
I'm thinking of some of these things, some similar systems I thought of, or that not I've thought of, that I've heard of in the past. Which is, again, there's an angry GM one, which is like, you know, as time passes, you like basically drop a d6 into a bowl, and then like whenever like enough time has passed, you just roll, like you roll the dice, and if one comes up a six, something happens, right? And it's like,
Oh, yeah. We talked about this. I actually like that mechanic a lot, but
yeah,
yeah, we had
yeah.
talked about that before.
Especially in burst, it's very kind of like visceral, because like, you just kind of like ominously drop the die into like the pot, right? So it's time's ticking, right? Um, that kind of thing. Um, but I think part of the thing that gets to me is that I think part of this is that GMs tend to want to roll too many of these dice in secret, because that's like more realistic. I think you kind of want the like some of this to be out in the open so that like you can kind of get a sense of how far you're progressing, right? Like, you want to like instead of just like rolling the perception in secret and then like somebody tells you nothing happens or it's like something happens, you roll it out in the open. You have a sense of how well you've done, and maybe you've got like percentage for like how explored the hex is or something, right? And along with that, right, you got to give them, I think, some more interesting choices. Um, in terms of your system, right? Like you could have, everybody in the party rolling, knowledge checks, but at that point, right, like, maybe that doesn't mitigate at all against something sneaking up on you, right? Like maybe the fighter has decided that, and I'm not great on like figuring out what the hell's in this region, but I am good at making sure that we don't get snuck up on, right? So while you guys are trying to figure that out, I'm doing a patrol and figuring that out, and so like that has some like known effect on like the chance of getting, if combat happens, that's a problem. The big problem here is actually very related to to last time's discussion, right? Like I think part of the biggest problem here is that like when you can devise these clever systems, but it's very hard to get the system to go to a point where you're making different decisions each time, right?
Yeah, I actually and this is part of what I'm trying to create, right? Which is like if you give people a basic thing and and they only have a limited choice, are they going to choose correctly or are they going to choose poorly, right? Like are they going to read you know, it's sort of almost like Tavern Keeper in that way, right? Like, are you going to read the quest text to know that you're sending the right person on? In this sense, it's are you understanding the basic prompt well enough that you are applying the correct skill choice to it, right? So, like, your default might be nature every time, but nature isn't going to have the answers, right? And sometimes you know, you might get wrecked because you didn't quite catch on that there was something more to, sort of this encounter. But I actually think that your example with the fighter is something that is also really interesting that I would also want to like delve into a little bit. I kind of like the idea of having a more robust system for like imagine it's the dice bowl, right? And you can make actions that give you information at the cost of those dice, but you could also make actions that remove those dice, right?
Mm,
So for instance, if the ranger is going to be scouting, making his nature check trying to see are there animals here that that are dangerous or that are we're in their territory, the cleric might be casting a spell or something kind of like along those lines, like a ritual to see if there's any ambient spirits here or something like that. The fighter could be, using perception checks to try and defend against them. So they're adding to the dice pool. You're removing from the dice pool, and the dice pool kind of becomes like the indicator for the party about like where they're like how much they are willing to risk for the information inside of the hex.
yeah, I think that's interesting. I think the key is built. Like I think that's about right. I think the key is building enough different types of hexes so that each one of those dice pool feels like a unique challenge. And people are making different
Yeah.
decisions in those situations.
And you would have to have enough different actions that like it's not correct for the party to execute the same
Yeah,
procedure every time, right?
yeah,
Um, which I think is that's actually probably the most difficult part. I think
yeah,
it would be very easy to say, oh, the ranger stealths around, the wizard casts a spell, the cleric does whatever, right? When you really want to create more variety so that players can really target what they are doing, if that makes sense.
yeah. And I think that needs to come with like a lot of kind of like I think it needs to not just be checks, like in terms
Yeah.
of like. And I don't mean that like like I think there needs to be a strong narrative behind that,
You know what?
right?
Actually, I have a better idea for this, which is not a necessarily like a better idea, but it is a imagine that there's like a pretty robust kind of clue system. This is something I was thinking about for Seventh Expedition, right? Like one of the narrative things that's nice about the expeditions is because there are six of them and they have all failed, right? Presumably, right? They never returned back to kind of civilization. You have narrative through lines for what happened to each of those, right? So I could follow the clues. I can go to a place. I discover, oh, here's a grave site for this person, and you cross-reference that with information. Oh, this person was a member of the third expedition, and they died because of this thing. And at the gravesite, you discovered, a compass, but the compass is broken. It's pointing in a different direction. And then this is giving you information about like different other hexes. And if this system is big enough, in my head, this is sort of like in the way that I wrote this for that campaign. This was built around breadcrumbing the narrative through line, right? If you want to follow the story of the sixth expedition, you can. You just go hex to hex to hex to hex to hex, and you're going to be doing all the other things in those hexes, right? But it does give you kind of like a light narrative direction to follow. But maybe the answer is you're getting these clues all the fucking time, right? You're getting them constantly. In any individual one hex, you're going to get 4 to 5 pieces of information about other hexes, right? And you can catalog that information for the players, right? So at a certain point, the players can be exploring, and then they can say, hey, we have like 5 or 6 pieces of information about this hex. We really know what's going on here, and this is a good time for us to go after it because we have a very solid understanding of what's here, right? And it also creates that decision making I was talking about earlier, where the player now goes, boy, the next logical hex for us to go on is this one, but it is completely dark. We've discovered no information about it, and I'm really nervous about kind of like walking into that sort of alone, right? But in a situation where you have these sorts of pieces of information, you're getting these sort of source of breadcrumbs. It almost functions the way that like the quest breadcrumbs in Skyrim do, right? Where it'll put the marker on your map for a dungeon there, and all you have to do is sort of like get there and go for it, and like you do the thing. And I think that would actually be really interesting and really powerful, and you could build it into this system, right? Where like, sorry, to I didn't actually explain this part, but like those clues are then gated by the decision making. Does that make sense?
So I,
So it is less about let's discover what this hex is. Let's discover clues about other hexes by making smart choices with the skills that we're using. Does that make sense?
it does, and I think you're mostly right. I think the thing that you need to do pair with this is get rid of hexes, right? Like, I don't think
Oh,
you.
interesting.
I think you want to be like, and you want to pick up a clue, right? I think like the inciting incident is like like the six like the sixth expedition, like you know like somebody ran, it's like a page from them ran back, and it's like the sixth expedition's already fucked, right? Like somebody go save them, right? And like that's your first thing, and you have a point on the map, and then you can adjudicate the again. I'm going to reference the angry GM. He's got a thing about this, I think, where like you point where you're going, and you've got the map, so you can figure out how you're going to get there, but it's not bounded by a hex, so there's not kind of like the color in the map type of stuff, which I actually don't think is. I think the problem is that's not actually compelling, right? Like, maybe you can like have like ways to find like sites along the way, right? Like to like add a little bit of pizzazz into it. But I think you actually kind of want to like do kind of like narrated overworld travel that takes like some real world time but not a ton, and isn't super dependent on kind of like rolling skill checks to fully explore areas, if that makes
I don't know, man. Abandoning hexes is tough because it's such a like. I
sense.
agree with you that it's not super compelling, but it's like an incredibly important. I feel like organizational tool. Like I just feel like there's like no good way to organize a map without hexes. I
um
mean, maybe you still could. It wouldn't necessarily have to be. You have to bunch the map out into discrete chunks like that, because otherwise all of this stuff it feels like falls apart. But
so
maybe that's like a GM thing. Like the
yeah,
GM knows
like the
that
GM has a
there
hex
are.
map, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and maybe it's not even hexes, right? Like maybe there are sections of the maps that are big long, rectangles, some that are circles, some that are, whatever. Like a mountain might be on the map as a triangle, and you kind of have a jigsaw. The GM would have like a jigsaw understanding of what that map looks like, right?
yeah.
Because they
So
would
like
see all
like
the
it
different situations.
so like an extra, like a real map, right? Like a detailed, like you have a detailed map, the players have
Yeah. But and
like a
like and like for the GM, right, you would still have discrete locations and boundaries for going from one area to another area, perhaps, right? But for the players, you could even ask them. You could say you can kind of give them a free map, and you can say, okay, well, where do you go, right?
yeah,
And they might make mistakes like they want a beeline to a place, and they might not take the road, right, which is one. Let's all say it's one squiggly area. They
right,
might go through 2 additional areas and have to deal with those 2 additional areas. So I
right.
actually do that. Okay, that's fair. I actually think that is maybe my favorite way of organizing the map, even if it would take some serious cartography skills, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no,
Um,
I
because
actually
I
think
do think that hex maps are a little gross in the sense that they do look, you know, I don't know, they look artificial, like manufactured, right?
yeah, and I think that like I think the cartography skills is like a lot truer than maybe you realize, which is like actually drawing a compelling map is tough, and also like in the real world, a lot of space is boring, right? Like
Yep.
you like in order for like like hexes that have interesting things in them to make sense, like you need to have a lot of bland and boring hexes, which I don't think is the right way to do it. I think it's kind of like you need to have like you need to be able to kind of like yada 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 over the empty hexes, right? Over kind of the blank space, but like in a way that like still lets you kind of like I want to like give the impression that like you're traveling a long distance where like nothing's happening, it's kind of boring, without actually having to make the players bored. Which
No,
is
well, so I actually think that that's a piece of the exploration that I want to keep in to put this in video game terms. If I'm in Skyrim and I want to go to the dungeon, I think it's a real thing that I walk up and holy shit, there's two giants. And now I have to deal
right.
with the giants, right? And I feel like that's kind of what having all these discrete populated areas sort of accomplishes, right? Because it also sort of means that maybe I get to the dungeon, but boy, those giants really kick the shit out of me, so we just kind of place a flag and say we'll come back to this later. And maybe you could do quite kind of a fast travel version of it. You've already cleared the hex, you've already killed the giants, right? You can move through that without any, you know, without having to like re-roll on some kind of like random encounter table. Or if you do, it's like much more diminished comparatively.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of this is actually going to be kind of like and then you travel the day without much happening, and then you go to sleep, right?
Yeah.
And
I actually think that it might be possible for you to travel through, maybe you could travel through hexes without kind of upsetting the encounter, maybe. Like you go through a hex and you think that there's nothing wrong there, but it's just because like you didn't proc the dragon that's in there kind of thing,
yeah,
and he
so
swoops down the next time you move through that hex because you think that it's fine.
yeah, the problem I have with that is like is like I think if you're like that's why I think you want to be out of the hex frame, because like if you think you've cleared a hex and it's not cleared, like that just like you get these kind of like like
Oh, I
oh
see what you're
I
saying.
failed
Yeah.
the perception check kind of like problems, right? Like which is like you either never know when you're done, or you like you're just kind of like coloring in the map, right? Like um uh,
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think you kind of want that kind of stuff, but I think you also need it to be like kind of like rare and not super like
It,
maybe
it can't be hard because you can't blitz a player, you can't blitz a party that is like if they made the decision we're too busted to do this dungeon, and then you drop a dragon on them, they're gonna die,
yeah.
and that sucks.
Yeah. And maybe this is kind of like, like behind the scenes, like, you know, when you roll the ominous dice pool, right? Like, the GM has a pool of things he can pull out of like the encounter set there, right? It doesn't have to like, maybe it's the dragon, maybe it's like, the pack of goblins, right? Like, and it's the GM discretion to pull out the right one at the right moment. Um, uh, what's I also like maybe like trailblazing needs to be a thing, like kind of like you can
Colonizing, like you could create a road so that
yeah,
you're not gonna
I
have
don't
to
think
worry
it
about
wants to
it.
be I don't think it wants to be a road, but I think it wants to be like,
Mhm.
somebody's drawing a map, and like, you're doing some whacking that maybe you can follow, and like, maybe that's like some survival checks or something. Again, I don't want to just be like roll a survival check every hex, but like something like that, right? So that like, you know, like maybe if you find yourself going back and forth across the same patch of land a bunch of times, well, maybe we'll spend the effort here to like lay down some like a rudimentary path that'll take some time or something. But it'll
Well,
be
so something that I think is interesting about that is the idea of like kind of base building, right?
yeah,
How do you want to handle, right? Like because in a real world version of this, I sort of would want the ability to sort of like make camp, right?
right.
But there aren't great systems for sort of like making not even making camp is like too minor for what I want to describe. Like making a temporary like stopgap that is not going all the way back to like an established town, right? But like this is a campsite that we are going to return to commonly. This is going to serve as sort of like a forward base for us, like a little nexus that we're
Yeah.
going to return to and resupply from all the time. I feel like I would want to create that's maybe like a later down the line sort of set of systems, but that's a pretty natural thing
Yeah.
for an exploring party to sort of to create, especially as they get farther and farther out there.
Yeah. So maybe this is like something like you find these breadcrumbs, you set out on like a sub expedition to go do those things, right? And like as you're going out and back, right? Like you're doing these, like the campaign, and maybe this is maybe kind of like what we're doing with the Star Wars game, right? Like, you know,
Yeah,
each week is kind of like you're going out to something and coming back, and like as you're getting further, it's getting harder to get out there with all your resources intact. Um,
yeah,
and coming back's a problem. So like you're building up enough money to kind of like, all right, we'll put this out here. We'll hire somebody from the town to go watch it, right? To like set up or like
yeah. I think this, and to be honest with you, I think this is all RP. I think
yeah,
that my initial instinct was to systemize it, to be like, oh well, maybe you could build buildings, you can make an outpost, you can put money into building a wall or whatever. But I think that all of that is a mistake. I feel like I would want players to like rescue someone. You rescue people, like a party of treasure hunters that left the island to go do whatever, like a group of hunters or something, and you rescue them and they're back at base. But then you can say, hey, listen, we're setting up a stronghold, right? Because we want to get into the deeper into the mountains, but we don't want to travel back to the island the whole time. Why don't you guys sort of plant that stake in the ground? And now, as the GM, I can kind of know, all right, the players have essentially decreed that a town is going to sprout up here, right? And all of that happens in an RP sense without any systemizing to it at all, really. I
you
think
know
that
what?
would actually be very
I I
natural and very cool.
I think you're absolutely right. I think you want to like put like a lot of like hooks out there, right? Like I think you want to be like, oh, and you come across an open field, right? Like you come like come across a
Yep.
clearing, right? Like things that like the players can note down and be like, well, this is being a pain. Maybe we should like start something a little bit more permanent. And then you'd be like, okay, like where would that be, right? Like you can like drive it to the players to be like, we want to start a town, we want to start it here, or we want to start at least an encampment, we want to start it here, and then like have them be like, okay, we want to be able to like repair our equipment out. Repairing is a weird one because there's not great degradation rules in PF2E, but
Hmm.
like we want a blacksmith, right? Like so we will go back to the town and bring forward, and go hire one to come out and right, or like a cook or something.
Yeah.
Um, I think like maybe that's like supported by like slightly better, slightly like something that could be systemized a little bit more is like maybe giving some like real value to like lavish accommodations, right? Like like they've there are systems for like the level of food and the level of like rest you have, like accommodation you have, but it doesn't have any like impact. So it's very easy to kind of ignore those things and be like you know all right, well we'll sleep in the
But you
freaking
give
forest.
everybody like a +2 competency bonus rested buff or whatever,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So like
something that
if
applies to
they're
the exploration skills, right? Like
yeah,
because
I get
that's
that for sure. I think that's smart. I think I like the idea also that it serves as a little bit of a gold sink, right? Like if you want to start this up, you have to spend as a party like 10 or 15,000 gold or something like that. Because one of the other features about an exploration game is that you have a much wider sort of economic model than in most tabletop
yeah,
RPGs, right? Like the way that I did loot in Hell's Rebels was I saw how much gold you guys were supposed to get for the level. I planned out all of the different encounters for that level, and then I divvied up amounts of gold into those different encounters until sometimes a little bit over, sometimes a little bit lesser, right? But like till I hit that cap, right? So everyone was basically guaranteed to get that value. But hypothetically speaking, if I'm planning out this like exploration campaign, I think it's important actually for players to be able to break that cap in a real way. And this also, by the way, was supported in Hell's Rebels because I did have like those bonus treasures and stuff like that. You guys were pretty ahead of Gold Cap because you'd found a lot of these or whatever. But I think that that's an important piece of the gameplay, right? If you aren't if you want to go out and say, you know what, we just need money. we don't need anything else but fucking money right now to, you know, hire a bunch of people to go make the outpost that we want at this whatever river fork, you know. Um, that I think is really, I think that would be a good way to sort of design the game and allow the GM on the fly to make adjustments to like how much gold like the players have and how much they're, you know, kind of like dealing with. I think part of this, by the way, is that I would be pretty restrictive with you know, items for order or whatever.
Yeah.
This became a pretty big staple of our games like later in the Pathfinder 1E cycle, where like people had a pretty comprehensive understanding of like the complete magical item, you know, database or whatever, and they were like googling to, ooh, what would be good for my next slot or whatever, and then placing custom orders for their next slot. I feel like in a game like this I would want to be much more haphazard with the way like loot works, and just lore wise say, listen, you guys are out on the edge of the world, you're not going to have access to basically anything like along those sorts of lines, right?
Yeah, like maybe
um
you can get yourself like some fundamental like +1s in striking runes, but like that's like it.
yeah. If you want to get yourself very basic level shit, that's fine. But I think I would want players to be like, you know, you delve a dungeon, you pick up a +3 spear of whatever the fuck, and you go, holy shit, this is gonna be the weapon that I'm using for the next like 3 or 4 levels, right?
Yeah, like
Um,
and that's like I think a tough thing to also like match with like people like I think PF2E does a good job of like making them runes. So like if you really want, you can just like strip them off and put them on the weapon you want, which
mhm.
I think is a good system relatively.
Yeah, me too.
Um, but like I think the system actually supports that kind of well, right? Like like this is only a level 2 town. You're never gonna have like a big enough thing, right? Like and like getting that to be bigger is like a project maybe that like you that put it on. But I think you're right. Like we want to make money. It's like well you don't just like go out and like you can't just like kill a wolf and like find gold in his stomach, right? Um, like in a video game. But like you could like be like, well, we need to make money. Let's go back to town. Let's see if anybody has anything they need done. And like there's somebody who's like, like, well, I need more bear pelts, but like a really fine bear pelt, and then you put a you put a breadcrumb on them, right? Like it's out in the forest over there. You got to go out to the forest, find the bears, kill them. Or really, like bears are probably a bad idea
Yeah,
because
I
bears
also
like a
think
more
that you
general
might
thing.
end up in situations where players, you know, they get to a bottom of a dungeon and there's this vast hoard of wealth or whatever, and they don't really need money, so they take the spear and they leave the gold, they leave the rubies, they leave the chest of rubies, but they go back later and they go, oh, you know what? We actually need that stuff, so let's go back and pick up the chest, right? And then sell that kind of like. I think those sorts of situations would also be pretty, you know, like pretty
I don't.
natural.
So I don't think that ever happens. I think like you find a
Oh, you
hoard of
think oh, okay, so players would take the spear, go back, unload, go back to the dungeon
yeah
immediately, sell the chest? Yeah, okay.
yeah
Now that I say that out, I agree.
yeah they'll figure out a way to do it. Like you just need to have a way to like. I think part of this too is like there's like like there's a lot of kind of like well I want to like put this to bed and like put it to bed but I don't have to worry about it, right? Like dungeons clear, we don't ever have to deal with it again, right? Like I've done it, like we're done with it.
Yeah,
And
I do think I would want to create some you know, like so for instance, something I could imagine doing, right, is like let's say you get to the bottom of the dungeon and there's a door and the door has a seal on it or whatever.
right
And like and like it's sort of almost like a Metroidvania in that sense, right? Where players they get this thing and it's like one of their, you know, this is a sealed dungeon door, you need 5 gemstones or whatever of specific things, and then maybe when they're level 8, 9, 10, they come back and they go, oh shit, this is the thing I needed to get into the like the back half of that, you know, like the back half of that dungeon. I do think that like that would be a cool thing for an exploration campaign sort of along these lines, is to get kind of, you know, essentially keys, metaphorically keys to locks that they will then get later, you know.
yeah no I think I think I agree with that. Yeah yeah I mean just to kind of like finish out a thought that I had about like the kind of like players gonna shuffle things out. I think this is like a thing where like it's time for the characters but it's not time at the table, right? Like you have to like shuffle stuff back and forth. You're not gonna make the players fucking like do that out in real time, right? Which is kind of the thing that works in like say something like Valheim, right? Where it's like
Yeah.
you actually have to have the person, your character has to actually walk back and forth. You can't get mad at the GM for like not letting you yada 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 over it. Like that's just the mechanics of the game. But yeah, but we're like 10 minutes over at this point, so I think we should move it into our weeks. Unless you had any
Sure.
final thoughts that you want.
I played an amazing amount of Valheim, as everyone who is listening to this podcast understands. We started playing on the weekend where we all started playing like almost like around midnight. I just like saw people online and I was a little bored in WoW. And I was just like, hey, let's see what Valheim has to offer. And then we ended up playing till like 6 a.m. And then the next night we ended up playing till like 6 a.m. And I have no idea why. Anybody who reads my Twitter sees I tweeted this. I was like, I cannot define what the secret sauce is here because I've played a ton of these games and very rarely have I gotten quite as sucked as I have with Valheim. But I got sucked, I guess into Valheim.
Yeah, I haven't played yet. I'm generally kind of like hands off for like early access titles for now.
Sure.
But it definitely looks super interesting. I've heard that like it also has like more like like Minecraft is the class kind of like you can build a castle in the sky because there's no real physics.
Yeah.
And
Oh no, there are fucking physics in Valheim. I learned that the hard way. A lot.
what do you mean by that? Like what happened? Like did your house fall
I
or
was
something?
building a so if you build, okay, let's say you build like a pole, right? And then you start putting horizontal beams on that pole, get it won't like droop, right? But it'll get less and less stable. So something that I was doing was I was building a new big building, right? Like a big kind of U like building. And I was just sort of mapping out the skeleton, right? So I was doing that. I put like kind of these vertical poles on the corners and I was going like big long stretches of horizontal poles, right? And then friend of the cast Lou ran up and jumped onto the pole and then over it, and it created this domino effect where that little stress like broke all of the individual pieces of wood, which was pretty funny. And there's a
That
lot of finicky rules about that kind of thing, like how to create kind of stable and strong structures if you want to create something that has two floors or whatever. There's better building materials over time, but finagling through those mechanics, like I'm literally just over here. Rachel is working on a bridge, trying to make a bridge over like a river, and she's been doing this for like 6 hours maybe. Like, just because it's a very complicated process compared to Minecraft, which is just pop pop pop
well,
pop pop
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
thing.
That's super interesting. It sounds like that's gonna be super fun. I'm probably gonna jump in
Something
because
that one thing I want to note that is great here is that Valheim has a rule that you can't do any building without a workbench nearby, which I absolutely love. I didn't understand it at first. I was like, "What the fuck is this rule?" And then Pockets, who is Bonjin or Gasty in the raid, said it's because they don't want people to do like the Fortnite thing where they're combat building. um by the way, I'm corrected, the bridge is done. Where I'm combat building, right, where part of my I'm running around and oh no there's bad guys, pop 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 pop, here's a bunch of walls and you know a roof, here's a whole fucking house that I can like defend myself from or whatever. Because of the way that like the building mechanics are very finicky and you need like a workbench there, it really prevents that, which I think is primo game design.
sounds like it. Sounds like it. It definitely sounds like a thing I'll check out at some point. But uh, at the moment, I've got too many other things to do.
Yeah, tell me all about Guilty Gear.
Guilty Gear Strive, the beta.
Guilty
What?
Gear Strive, the beta.
Yeah, yeah. So the beta was this weekend. And it's a fighting game. If anybody at home has seen Guilty Gear stuff, it feels like Guilty Gear, and it feels great. It's simplified from the kind of old ones in a lot of ways. Like they're called anime games, are generally known for being like super combo dependent. This game is, but it's not nearly as bad. It's a lot more approachable. It just feels great. It's got a lot of style. The Guilty Gear series has always been great about style. Great
Yeah.
about great music. It's like everything's like very rock and roll inspired. And I just had a great time. It's got good net code. It's got rollback. and I'm not the best player, but I was having fun. Felt like I felt first time in a long time I felt like I want to go into the lab and learn what I need to do. It's got enough depth that there's still stuff to practice, right? There's still enough like kind of physical execution component there. Like I really like Samurai Showdown, and I played that for a while.
Yeah.
But the big thing there is just like there's not combos, and like every hit does like a ton of damage, which I liked a lot. But like there's also like it's all about playing the game, and it's not as much about execution, which is again a good thing in some ways. But it also had horrible netcode. It had some other problems, but like um, there's not as much need to lab things, at least the way that I felt, and maybe I'm very wrong about that, but that's at least that's how it felt to me. Guilty Gear, it's like I need to learn how to like pull off this kind of like you know uh uppercut into air grab, into if I've got the resources I'm gonna Roman cancel into an overhead type of deal, like all this kind of stuff where I'm just like sitting there like banging out these things over and over and over again, right? Like I was at the point where I was like, I need to make sure I've got my execution down. So like, in between matches, I'm just, doing the inputs over and over again to make sure that when the time comes and I need to do it in game, I can do it and I can like hit the thing. And it's like, it felt so good whenever like whenever I got it down, right? I read him, I did the proper anti-air and it was a counter hit. So I did the kind of air grab. I play Potemkin for anybody who watches, who knows he's a grappler. Um, but like just like always like when you get it just right, it just feels so satisfying, right? Like you get the grab off, you do the buster, like you do the leap there, you get the counter hit off, and you just totally dominate someone. It just feels great. Um, I'm so excited for this game to come out for real, just because it's been a blast. Been a lot more fun with the fighting game than I've had in a while. I can't like besides like the style stuff. I don't know if I can quite put my finger on it, but it just feels good. Feels good, man. Um, yeah. So that was
Well,
the
that's good. This fighting game stuff is always very weird to hear because like there was a small amount of time where I was like but this was like 20 years ago at this point, right? Like where I was like in the fighting community, um, and I'm just like I feel like you're describing mechanics in modern WoW, and I'm someone who only ever played Classic. You know what I mean? Like it's
yeah.
just
Oh
so
yeah.
much more advanced now.
So part of it too is that like some of the stuff is common, but like there's also like series specific stuff. There's stuff that I have to look out, right? Like OTG means on the ground, which I can never remember. I only remember it now because somebody went over it, right? Or like there's some common terms, but like Roman cancel is very specifically a Guilty Gear term. It gets applied to other things, but it's basically you spend a bar to extend a combo. Um, and there's some nuances there, but like you hit a button and instead of supering, you slow down your opponent and you can get another combo off. And it's got different properties. Like I said, very specific to the game. And there's other stuff in there too, but it's like it's just enough there for me to like really latch into without being so much that I feel overwhelmed. Like
Yeah.
when several years ago I went to Evo, um, and I saw the Guilty Gear finals, and it was fucking fantastic. It looked great. I was sitting there, and I literally picked up, took my phone and I ordered it off of Amazon because I'm like, I want to play this game. And I sat down to play it, and it's like, all right, like do a basic combo. It's 17 button presses. And I'm like, I can't fucking do this, right? Like, and I'm like, and the bigger part of that is like, I'm never going to be in a position where I can understand that well enough to apply it in a game in a way that makes sense, right? I think this has definitely brought things down enough so that like I can see what I'm doing. I know how to apply it. I know like where the decision points are, and it's comprehensible enough to me for me to like do it while I'm playing. Like, okay, this is that situation. I can. So this is the game plan, right? Like, this is a thing that you need to have a game plan going into a fight. It's like I can build a game plan. I can start to execute on it. And I can recognize where the holes are, and like maybe start to build out the game plan. Um, and I haven't felt that way since like Street Fighter 4. Street Fighter 5, I think like the potential was there. It just never really grabbed me. But I
Mm.
think this is like got like a thing that'll like really grab me. But who knows? Maybe in like I think it comes out in April. Maybe in like May, I'll be like, yeah, I played it for a week and now I'm done. But we'll see how it goes. Um,
Well,
well,
very cool. The other thing I did this week was run a fucking Gazillion mythics, just every time. We finally cracked the 15 barrier, which was a lot of fun. It was me and friend of the cast Lindley. Um, I was just like in a group and we really needed a tank, and I saw him online. I was like, "Hey, bud, do you want to come tank this? 13?" And he was like, "Yeah." And we did it, and we timed the key, which was great, right? We timed this 13, and we two chested it, and I immediately got in the chat because if you two chest a key, it is going to upgrade twice, right? From a 13 to a 14, then a 14 to a 15, right? And I was like, let's run that 15. And everybody in the group was like, okay, but none of us had ever run a 15 before. And to be honest, we actually did pretty well, all things considered. We only whiffed the timer by about 2 minutes, which was probably just because we were pretty slow and methodical about like the pulls and everything like that. Everybody, there was like some small wipes. It was also basically going from the easiest dungeon, Miss of Tyrannus Scythe, to maybe the hardest dungeon, second hardest dungeon, I would say. The other side, and man, that was just an experience, and I'm very glad. It was a lot of fun. I swear to God, I'm gonna get fucking Keystone Master this season. The other news, which like I want to talk about, but like there just isn't a ton to talk about, was BlizzCon was this weekend.
Right.
BlizzCon Line. But one of the most interesting things that they did, which I thought was, well, it was interesting, is they didn't announce any systems for World of Warcraft. All of the new stuff for World of Warcraft. First, we're getting World of Warcraft Burning Crusade Classic. Everybody knew this was coming. Um, then they kind of outlined 9.1. With most of the stuff you expect: new raid, new zone, uh, a mega dungeon. One of the interesting things is that this is the latest 9.1 patch, but it is also the patch that is carrying the most content. Typically, the 9.1 patch comes pretty quickly after, and it doesn't include a boatload of content, right? So for in Legion, the 7.1 patch was Suramar, right? It was that whole Suramar storyline, and also um it was like the Hell invasions or whatever. Like Helya's forces were invading, and then technically 7.1.5 had the Nighthold raid, right? So there was also a raid in the 7.1 patch. In 8.1, there was the Jazar lore raid, right? In that 8.1 patch, and it was also like a new Warfront and stuff like that. But like most of the, generally speaking, it wasn't a new zone, it wasn't new anything like that. That all came in 8.2, 7.2. So this is the first time that we're actually like seeing something kind of along those lines in the point one patch of an expansion, which is kind of neat. But also at the same time, this is the longest we have gone in basically since I think Warlords, maybe, and even Warlords were coming up on it because it's 6 months, and so that's next month. To be playing in the point oh patch of an expansion. So I feel like there's that's neat and interesting, and I want to know more about sort of like the decision making behind Blizzard's process. But like I said, they didn't include any system stuff, which I was expecting. I was expecting them to say you're going to get 2 legendaries, or the item level on legendaries are increasing and going this way, or there's going to be a new soulbind tree, or we're extending the trees, or any
Well,
of those sorts of lines. But they actually started the what's next panel with Ian Hazakostas basically saying, you know what, we don't know what's going on with the systems. We're gonna put shit up on the PTR. You decide.
I thought that
Which I found.
I thought they said they were expanding the soulbind system.
Did they say that they're expanding the soulbind system?
Yeah, I remember a lot of talk about, like, we want people to be able to make more interesting decisions with the soulbinds.
Yeah, so I definitely expect those things to happen, but they offered no specifics. Normally,
Okay.
in the What's Next panel, they talk about this is the new thing that's coming, right?
Oh,
These are
okay.
the changes we're making to the systems of the game, right? Like so in 8.2, it was talking about Azeroth, or the Heart of Azeroth and the essences. In 7.3, it was talking about the Netherlight Crucible, the thing where you could like add little modifiers to your relics or whatever on your weapon, stuff like that, right? Corruptions would be a good example in 8.3. But they didn't do any of that stuff, which I thought was nuts. And then also there's like the story based content, which is the jailer has mind controlled Anduin and turned him into bad boy. He's bad guy in that
Yes.
in that trailer. So
Spoilers. He's
I guess, yeah,
Arthas.
spoilers. Yeah,
Yeah.
yikes. I don't see. I contest that he's Arthas. I think
He's
that he is markedly different. I had a lot of conversations with people who were talking about how Arthas he was, and I do think that there are obviously like parallels, but fundamentally Arthas like made the decision to become this, whereas Anduin had that forced on him.
No,
Right?
so I think it's supposed to be Arthas is like possessing Anduin, is what it's supposed to be.
Oh, drama.
I
Wow.
I mean, so maybe I'm wrong, but like that is like I thought that was like obvious, but so I guess I'm probably wrong about that.
You know,
So
maybe I have thought that the little thing that he pulls out. There's a cutscene that's in the
oh,
game
the
now
key.
where the jailer pulls out a crystal and they hammer it into Shalamorn, right? Which is now Kingsmorn, I guess is what they call it. I call it Shalamorn because I think that sounds cooler. The sword is Shalamain. Now it's Shalamorn, you guys. Anyway, I think that crystal might be Arthas, like might be Arthas' soul in the same way that Ner'zhul was in the Helm of Domination.
Hmm.
But who knows? You know.
Yeah, that's interesting. Huh. Huh. All right. I guess we'll find out.
Yeah.
Although, like, this continues the grand tradition of like fucking, you know, impressive characters getting jobbed in this expansion, right? Like, like the Archon or whatever, like, Art, Andu Arthas or whatever he's supposed to be, just like kind of like, throws down a smoke bomb and like just like stabs her through the fucking heart, and that's it, right? Like, there's not like, and this bothered me. This is kind of like the level of kind of like somebody got fired for that blunder level thing. But like she's holding a sword and she points it at him and he throws down the smoke bomb, and then when he leaps in the air, she's not holding anything. Like
She just dropped it off screen, Mango. Come on, continuity isn't real. No,
uh,
I get that for sure. This sort of stuff doesn't bother me all that much. But I definitely see this in the community. Like people got so fucking mad that Sylvanas beat Bolvar on the in the Shadowlands cinematic, which I think is just because people fucking hate Sylvanas and and I'm just like, I don't know, man. Who cares? Like,
you,
this is very like, who would win, Superman or Goku level bullshit for me. It's like whoever the writers need to win at any individual time, kind of thing, right? Like the power level of this stuff that happens in cinematic is just so far divorced from like the game as we all know it and understand it that I don't really feel like talking about that stuff is ever productive. I
so
don't know.
so
Is that mean? Is that wrong?
so I agree with you kind of from like a writing perspective, but just from kind of like it seems like he got jobbed level perspective, right?
Oh yeah,
Like and I get it. It's like a 2-minute cinematic, but it's like the fucking raid fights last longer than that, right? Like it's
yeah.
at least like have a little bit of build up, but I get it. I get it. This is something that is perpetually amusing to me. You get these beautiful, gorgeous cinematics for all these inciting incidents, and like everything always ends, it's like always like something that needs to be solved, so it's always like kind of on a down note, and then like the solutions are always in game, so it's like a machinima of like some like nerds like running around and spinning while like like doing a raid boss, right? Like
You know what's funny? Actually, this was a complaint in BFA because they didn't do that. The Sour Fang Sylvanas cinematic, right, where they like, and it's the war campaign. Sour Fang and Sylvanas have a Makura, and he tricks her into kind of like revealing that she doesn't actually care about the Horde, right? Um, People were really mad about that because it happened in a cinematic and it didn't happen in game. They're like, my character's just fucking sitting on the sidelines and lets this happen. Or the same thing is true of N'Zoth, right? Like they really hated the ending of the N'Zoth fight because like you charged the Heart of Azeroth and Kamehameha N'Zoth, right? And people were super furious about that because they were just like, the raid encounter should be cool, not the cinematic after the raid encounter, which I think both of those are unfair. But it is actually kind of funny because if I were to be sitting down watching the YouTube videos of the cinematics in order, you actually would get very little like connective tissue because so much of that happens in game.
oh yeah, no, and like I think that makes sense, right? Like that's the way it
Yeah.
has to go. But like I just find it like it's just funny, right? It's like because the trailers are so fucking beautiful, right? They're
Yeah.
like amazing. And then it's just like 4 pixels of like 15 guys like spinning around in circles, right? Like that actually does the damage. But yeah. On the other side of things, I watched Goodfellas for the first time, which was
You
pretty
never seen
great.
Goodfellas?
No.
Wow.
Um,
It was a big college movie. I think I saw that in 2 different film classes in college.
it's
Everybody always wants to talk about the one shot that they have in the Cabana Club because it's
oh,
like
it's a
famous.
long. So hey, I fucking like I didn't know about that, but like I was like, oh, that's a long shot. I feel special. It's a long shot. It's like a single shot. I recognize that filmmaking technique. Um,
That shot is super famous and gets referenced all the time in film courses. And there's two of them. It's that. There's a bunch of these actually, but there's that one, and then there's also the. Have you ever seen 2001: A Space Odyssey?
No.
There's a
I,
cut where like a monkey picks up a bone and he uses it to beat another monkey to death, and then at the end he throws the bone into the air, and then the bone cuts, and it's not a bone anymore, it's a space station, right? And it's called the Kuleshov effect, right? Which is where like you impart meaning on two different images by putting them right next to each other, right? If you got from one thing to another thing, you are creating meaning by having those two things happen in sequence. People always use the Cabana Club to explain a oneer, right? Like doing everything in that one long shot. People always use the fucking monkey bone from 2001 to explain the Kuleshov effect, such that it's actually a meme. Like it's a light meme on like film Twitter, right? That people will reference that kind of thing.
so
But what did you think of Goodfellas?
I thought it was great. Um,
Hmm.
so there's like a connection there that like my family isn't involved in the mob at all, but like there's a lot of kind of like big Italian family stuff that like
Sure.
that translated for me and resonated with me, which I thought was interesting. Um, also like the thing, like it's like Ray Liotta and who's Joe Pesci is supposed to be like 20. I'm like, there's no way they're fucking 20, right? Like, um, but it was it's 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 a good movie. It's it's a slower paced movie, and I think that like kind of like I saw like the bones of that become like the excruciating level that was The Irishman, which I thought was like hard to sit through. Um, uh, which is in a lot of ways a very kind of like the same movie but like transposed a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I like Goodfellas a lot. It might be one of my favorite. I think probably The Departed is my favorite gangster movie, but Goodfellas is probably up there. I have a problem with a lot of these gangster movies which is that they all sort of hand wave at the gangster stuff happening. I think maybe my favorite gangster stuff is probably Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad. More Better Call Saul, to be honest. Just from the perspective of I want to know how the business works, right? Like I want to see the fundamentals of the supply chain, right?
Well,
Which you
Goodfellas
get in
goes
those
into that.
TV shows that I didn't feel. We get in like a montage, right? But I don't know. There's just something about like I really I'm kind of shitting on The Sopranos here. The
Okay.
Sopranos talks about mob stuff, right? But like you never get to like see or really like understand it, right? It just
Okay.
kind of like presumes, oh, this guy's a big earner. This guy's a made man. And you understand that on like a relationship level, but you don't understand it on kind of like an industry level where I want to get that.
Yeah.
What is specifically happening that is making these guys like their money sort of thing?
Yeah. And like I said, I think they go over the fact they rob a lot of stuff in
Yeah.
Goodfellas. Like I actually I want to note that I think that they did a better job of that than I think in most movies. Like I would generally agree with you. I think
Yeah, I do think that that's true. They didn't even do that. I mean, I like The Departed for I guess other reasons, just because like the drama of it is so good. But
yeah.
they don't even do that in the fucking Departed.
But
The Wire is also an amazing example of this. One of the reasons why I really love The Wire because they really lay it all out. Like they explain beat by beat, person by person, right? Like, and you see the whole breadth of the sort of like the business behind it all, and that's so compelling. I don't know why. Maybe because it's taboo or something. Like it's just like ooh, drugs.
it's funny because I'm thinking of that kind of like the scene of like you know Henry Hill's last day, kind of, right? It's like I gotta go drop off the weapons, and then I gotta go deliver the drugs. It's like then I gotta make the sauce, gotta make sure the sauce is done, and that's like just kind of like
That was my favorite part, to be honest. That's something that reminds me a lot of my dad. Because my dad would do this, like, I mean, because he lived in Italy for a while, so it's not quite like a big Italian family like thing, but it is a him thing
right,
because, he sort of has that, like, I guess I would call it like an Italian kitchen sensibility, if that makes sense, to like
sure,
making the sauce.
yeah, no, I absolutely get that, right?
Actually, the one that really gets me is the one in the prison when they're all in the prison
Oh,
making dinner together. That reminds me a lot of like the way that my family used to make those sorts of dinners.
and like the oh man, so the thing that like you know the scene where like the women are like kvetching and like you know his Karen's just kind of like, what have I fucking married into, right? Like
Mm,
that like like I so like my family my extended family used to do this thing where you know what was the name of it? They're like little fried dough balls with honey that you make around Christmas. Um,
I don't know what those are.
strufala.
Okay.
But like the thing that you know, the women would all sit down and like make the strufala, right? Like they do it like you know like a week before Christmas happened, right? And one year I went because like I like cooking, right? And I'm like the only dude there. Otherwise, it's just like these old Italian women all kvetching about like. So it's not like you know kind of like the makeover stuff they're doing in the movie, but it's like very much the same kind of like conversations where it's like you know like they're all bitching about whatever. You know again speaks to my soul. Um,
Yeah.
and the other movie I watched this week. Have you ever seen They Came Together?
Yeah. Yes. That movie's amazing. Have I not talked to you about this movie?
I
That movie is amazing.
Yeah,
It is so fucking funny. I could not believe it. The first thing, because it just looks like a dumb rom com,
right.
right? And then you watch it, and it is just the greatest thing. I had okay. There's a part in the movie where Bill Hader turns to his wife and says something about like a wet stinky shit. What does he say? It's like a line.
Uh, I
And then
I I forget exactly, but I know what you're talking about.
he says that line, and that line, my boss at Square Enix quoted that line to me as if it was like a reference that I understood. And I was like, what? And he was like, have you never fucking seen this movie? And I was like, no. And he was like, it's go like watch it now. Don't read anything about it. Just watch it. And I did. I basically just like lost my shit. It is so funny.
Yeah,
It's so funny.
it's great. It's interesting because like I like it a lot, but I think that like it's a little much sometimes, and like I think there's actually an interesting thing to talk about here because like, and maybe this is a thing for another episode, but like because it's such a parody, like I think you lose some of like the like stakes you get in other comedies. Like in like a real romantic comedy, there's the stakes of the romance. Like in Dodgeball, there's the stakes of like them losing the gym or whatever. But um in They Came Together, because you know it's all just kind of like screwball, right? Like you know there's like I think some of the jokes are like I think they do the kind of like you know repeated thing a little too much, but like there's also a lot of stuff that's like unsaid but like hilarious, right? Paul Rudd's character's apartment being like the typical you know like kind of like the typical Brooklyn apartment that doesn't make any sense. It's like you know giant room, 3 clocks on the walls, a bunch of signs, just kind of like you know they don't call it out, or like he does a scene where he's talking with his brother, and like you were talking about the shots earlier, right? Like they do the back and forth, and it's like Dutch angles for no reason at all. And I'm just like sitting there like losing my shit because like it's like they're clearly just like you know playing on this, but like it's you know you're right. It is so good. It is
The
so good.
quote, by the way, that I'm quoting is when you've been married as long as we have, taking a stinky shit is better than having sex.
Six.
Which is like
Uh,
oh my god. Oh, this movie. Holy shit, that
and
movie is
and
funny.
it's in response
I
to
yeah.
Amy Poehler's character saying like you know our caramel swirls are better than sex, right?
Yeah.
Like and he's like take your stinky shit, but, you know, it just like the whole framing device is great too, right? Like you know because it's like the frame is just Bill Hader and I forget who plays his wife
Isla
is
Fisher, maybe? Can't remember who it is.
and like Amy Poehler and Paul Rudd like they're talking about like our our you know, our love story is kind of like a cheesy rom com, right? And like, in the middle of the movie, they're like, you know, but this isn't a rom com; it's real life. And she turns and like looks at the camera, just kind of like, it's,
Yeah, there's also a bunch of man, there's just like a bunch of small stuff that
yeah,
is like really detailed where like Paul Rudd talks to his like friends and he's like, guys, I really like need advice. Where he's like, I'm gonna give you this like advice, but I'm not gonna show up for the rest of the movie or whatever. Where he's like talking to his like best friends that are all like inexplicably playing basketball.
uh,
They're all really bad. Man, I don't want to ruin this.
oh,
I don't want to ruin this. Watch this movie. This movie
yeah,
is great. It has so many good bits.
yeah. It is. So this is actually a thing that I think is interesting because I think they missed the mark a couple of times because it's like what it's classic kind of like sketch writers write a movie stuff, right? Like they're
Yeah.
all like great sketches, but like it gets a little like and like um there's a gag where Paul Rudd and Amy Poehler at like a coffee shop, and she gives him a very complex order, and like it works for a little bit, and then like the kind of like end gag is the the person taking the order says describes the order as a number three, right? And then they zoom in on like the board showing that number three is that order. I think it would have worked better like if they just didn't have the zoom in, just like a coffee and a number three and like left it unsaid. And they're very good about that in other parts, right? Like I said, like they don't ever lampshade the fact that like the apartments are
Yeah, and they also
ridiculous.
don't roll it forward. For instance, I think Dewey Cox, which we did a podcast on, did this very well, where they kind of roll forward the absurdity of their own world, right? So it's like at first you keep seeing that Dewey Cox is going home, and there's like a million kids because there's always like inexplicably all these kids in the beginnings of these movies. But then the movie ends with him playing catch with all of his kids he's never fucking met, and it's like it progressively it maintains sort of the absurd world building, I guess is
Right.
what I would call it,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Or like Communities would sort of do stuff like this, right? Where like the rules of the world are still consistent even if they are absurd, right?
Yeah. Whereas
Which I don't feel like this movie did that.
it doesn't. That's actually
Yeah.
very important, right? Like it doesn't, and like and that lets them be freer and like being like more and more ridiculous. Like they can be like off the wall in a way that doesn't really make sense. But like it also
Mm,
kind of like this is also part of what I talk about. Like the stakes aren't really there, right?
yeah.
Even like the farce that is supposed to be like their romance is like so far out of they can solve it however they want, and you won't be expected to like make it make sense in the real world, right? Like that, like it kind of like loses a little bit of the bite, but it's still very funny. Highly recommend it. Um, yeah. But we're way over time at this point. You have anything else
We
you
are
want to
way
talk
over
about?
time.
Do you have anything else you want to talk about before we get out of here?
No, I'm good. I'm done.
All right. If you'd like to email us and tell us what you thought about any of the things we talked about on this podcast, exploration, we came together, World of Warcraft, you can email us at subversiveplaygames@gmail.com or podcast at subversiveplaygames.com. You can follow us on twitch.tv/subversiveplaygames, where these go out live now. Rate and review us on iTunes, like us on SoundCloud, do all the other things. Just do stuff on podcatchers. Listen to us. Tell us you love us. Please. I'm so lonely. I think that's everything I had. But you have anything you want to promote?
I have nothing else I'm looking to promote.
All right. Well, in that case, until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.